Happy Thursday to you, March 18th, 2021. Glad you stopped by. I'd like to welcome you to this podcast, this very first episode of the podcast, Sex, Addiction, and the Missing Piece. As intimacy increases, you'll find the missing pieces. My name is Ken Donaldson. I'm your host. And just to tell you a little bit about me, I'm a licensed mental health counselor, a board certified addictions counselor, and also a clinical sexologist. I'm currently in a PhD program working on a dissertation that is about sexual addiction. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is sexual addiction. You've probably heard something about it in the last 24 hours. In fact, the media has used those two words in the last day, probably more than those two words have ever gotten press before. Unfortunately, there was a shooting up in Atlanta in which some people were killed and some people were injured. Very unfortunate. My heart goes out to those families and individuals. And yet the media grabbed hold of this sexual addiction, apparently, that the shooter, the person that's been accused of the crimes, has been labeled as sexual addiction. Two words, simple words. In fact, when I was actually planning this podcast, I was going to start by saying, hey, here's two words, sex and addiction. When you think about those words, what comes to mind? Let's start with the word sex. What kind of thoughts? What kind of feelings, images, memories? Addiction. What kind of thoughts come up with that? What kind of images? What does it remind you of? Then put those two words together, sexual addiction. What do those two words mean to you? What do they convey? If you're drawing blanks, or maybe you came up with a picture of the guy in the trench coat that hasn't showered and hasn't shaved and sort of nasty looking, that probably puts you in the norm. See, those two words, sex addiction or sexual addiction, are two words that are very, very misunderstood. Part of the reason is because we don't talk about them. I mean, think about it. Where did you learn about sex? Where did you learn about addiction? Unless you're somebody that's gone off the beaten path and studied it, researched it, or been involved in the treatment of it, you probably don't know anything about it. You probably have a lot of ideas, conceptions, and most of them most likely are not good. And that's unfortunate. And we can point fingers as to why that is and where it comes from. But the bottom line is that we're pretty poorly educated when it comes to sex and addiction. And you may have caught that in the subtitle of this podcast. I've titled that as Intimacy Increases, You'll Find the Missing Pieces. You might be curious about, how does intimacy fit into sexual addiction? Well, intimacy is sort of like the anti-addiction. So you can't have intimacy, you can't have closeness, you can't have vulnerability, you can't have connection in the face of addiction, whether it's sexual addiction or any other kind of addiction. But sexual addiction particularly has been a very challenging subject matter, hence part of the reason I wanted to research it. Call me a glutton for punishment. I'm lucky that I've had the opportunity to work with a number of people who've struggled with sexual addiction, and none of them, I want to let you know, were murderers or even close to it. The fact that the media is using this terminology as their headlines is a little bit disappointing because they're putting out a term that most people don't have any idea what it means. And now they've associated it with a mass murder. In reality, that person is probably what we would call psychotic, very ill, very delusional, has a lot of mental health challenges, issues, maybe also was engaged in some sexual addiction. The reports I read said that he spent hours and hours on online pornography, and perhaps they thought may have visited these massage parlors to get one of those inappropriate massages. But that does not mean that sexual addiction or somebody who struggles with it is going to go out and kill somebody. The reality is most of the people that I've met that are struggling with this are not bad people. They certainly would not commit murder. And again, it's unfortunate that the media seems to have to use something to make a headline. And so now, unfortunately, we've paired up sexual addiction with murder. Not the best press in the world. But let me back up a little bit because there's a bigger story here. Within the world of mental health and addiction, you see, we amongst ourselves have been arguing about this sexual addiction. And in fact, we have a manual that we use. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. You might have heard of it. And in it, it has all of the diagnoses, all of the official diagnoses for any kind of mental health issue or addiction issue. And sexual addiction or sex addiction is nowhere to be found. It's not even an official diagnosis. Now, the World Health Organization has given it some visibility and credibility. However, they decided to call it compulsive sexual behavior disorder, not sexual addiction. Now, why is that? Well, there's a big power struggle over that addiction word. It's a word that a lot of people, quite frankly, don't want to use. I was lucky back in 1991 to have a class in which I had to do a term paper in my graduate studies. The class was on human sexuality and marriage therapy. And the professor allowed us to do research on pretty much whatever we wanted in that realm. And me, being the addictionologist that I was, and just had started working with my very first client who happened to identify himself as struggling with a sexual addiction, I figured, well, I don't know much about this. I learned about drugs and alcohol and gambling a little bit. So I spent a semester researching. Now, this was back in 1990 or 1991 and didn't have the internet. So I was looking things up on microfiche and getting journal articles. And there really wasn't a whole lot that I found. But what I did find was really curious. I found that back then, and then we're talking 30 years ago, there were 6, 8, 10, maybe 12 different pieces of research I found in which the primary subject matter was what to call this. And really, it was about an argument. It shouldn't be called sexual addiction. It should be called sexual compulsivity, or it should be called sexual impulsivity, or it should be called hypersexuality. In fact, there were even some clinicians, some researchers that said that it should be called Don Juanism, or nymphomania or erotomania. And there were a lot more pieces of research that were trying to argue not only what to call it, but also how to classify it. Some wanted to refer to it as an impulse disorder. Some wanted to refer to it as an anxiety disorder. Some wanted to refer to it as a sexual dysfunction. And then there was a few people that wanted to refer to it as an addiction. And there began to be this power struggle over what to call it, how to classify it. And in the meantime, regardless of what we're going to call it or how we're going to classify it, in the meantime, there's a lot of people struggling, wrestling, being tormented by it. And why these arguments are going on, they're not being treated. There's a number of professional organizations that have to do with sexology and sex. I contacted about close to 20 of them just to find out what their stance was regarding sexual addiction. Most of them who did respond, some of them I haven't heard back from yet, most of them said they didn't have a stance. Some of them went as far as saying they didn't want to take a stance because it was so controversial. There's one that just flat out said, we don't believe in it. It doesn't exist. And there was one that also fully embraced it. The DSM that I was talking about earlier is put out by the American Psychiatric Association, a huge organization. They don't recognize it. There's another organization that's called the American Society of Addictive Medicine, in which these are medical professionals that have embraced addiction, believe in addiction, and are treating addiction and trying to help people with addiction. They do embrace it. We call this a behavioral addiction. Now, in my research, I have read probably about 100 research articles. In fact, for those of you that are able to see this, because I'm video recording it as well, I'm going to show you my box. A big box. And for those of you that are just listening to this, it's a box that's packed full of journal articles that I've read, highlighted, outlined, made little notes on. And I'm looking over my bookcase here. I have probably, 15 to 18 books that I've read and quite a few more to go through, at least 30. That I've identified as being helpful with this topic. But the more I dive into this, the more I realize that there's so much misinformation, unfortunately. And so I'm taking it upon myself today. This is not what I had planned at all to launch my podcast. This sort of just fell in. Taking it upon myself to try to offer some education here and to prevent some misinformation from going too far. We all need to come together and speak the same language if we're going to get anywhere. I talked earlier about part of the goal of this podcast is not just to talk about sex and addiction and the missing piece, and that's this kind of peace, the peace symbol, the inner peace, but also intimacy, connection. This unfortunate incident that happened up in Atlanta, been labeled as sexual addiction, the person that got charged with the crimes, but let's look at the lack of intimacy, connection that's part of this. We all have heard about it. We all know that racism is alive and well, unfortunately, today. And all too often it's happening. We can't be judgmental of people. We can't have prejudices against people and at the same time have intimacy. It's one or the other. So I hope you'll come back and join me again as I explore and share with you some of this amazing research that I found about sex, addiction, and the missing piece, and about intimacy, which to me, that's part of the cure. Connection. How do we build relationships in a healthy way? I hope you'll come back again. I hope you'll ask questions because I'm open to them. We're going to have exciting guests. We're going to look at this from a very holistic perspective. We're going to look at the history of sexual addiction. Where did it come from? We're going to look at why are we having such a hard time with the proper labeling and the classification, but also the socio-cultural dynamics involved. How the media and advertising and marketing has really used sex in a way it's become sexualized in the role that plays. We're going to look at some spiritual perspectives even. I'm going to go out on a limb with that one because I don't have any degrees in theology or divinity or any kind of ministry. But we want to look at the whole picture, the holism. So again, I hope you'll come back and join us. My name is Ken Donaldson. This is Sex, Addiction, and the Missing Piece. As intimacy increases, you'll find the missing pieces. Thank you.